Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event, Political Economy in a Time of Monsters, which is being recorded as the last episode in the first After Order podcast series, which is the result of a collaboration between Alameda and Macrodose and is produced by Planet B Productions. Thank you all for coming out today, full house on a Tuesday night, which is great. My name is Juliano Fiori, and I am the director of Alameda, which is an international institute which was founded in 2023. With the aim of conducting research connected with social and political organization to contribute to strategic responses to catastrophe. And when we talk about catastrophe, we're not talking just about the crises that proliferate on a day-to-day basis. We're talking about the big threats, the catastrophic threats that already dominate our collective horizon. So what that means is we try to engage in different kinds of engaged analysis at different scales, and we try to connect responses at different scales. And so the After Order project, which this podcast is part of, has been trying to do this. And we do it in particular in connection with two different concepts, order, one, and sovereignty being another, which have allowed us to think about questions in the international realm, questions of geopolitics and geoeconomics, with questions within the nation state, the exercise and claim to power. And today, we're going to be talking a little bit about this project or things related to this project, but I suppose starting from a premise that is underlying this project of After Order. Well, it's in the name. That is, if we are at the end of this thing that people refer to as order, whether that's international order, liberal order, neoliberal order, some kind of order, albeit a partial one, then we aren't necessarily going to be moving swiftly into another kind of order that looks the same. That is, we might be in a period of recurring crisis in which different kinds of hegemonic formation start to break up before they're fully developed. In a way, we're contesting the way in which people have invoked the Gramscian concept of interregnum. And so you might ask, if you know that reference, why we've called this event Political Economy in a Time of Monsters. Now, against the claims of many of my team who very anti-Arsenal. It is the time of Arsenal. And Arsenal is not one of the monsters, I assure you. In fact, that reference to the time of monsters, that the old is dead and the new can't be born, this is the time of monsters, that's a misquote. It's one of those things where a paraphrase has been remembered or has entered memory as the original statement, when that's not the case. In fact, Gramsci refers to various morbid symptoms that appear. But it's interesting to think of this as a time of monsters. There is a risk associated with that because thinking about monsters can lead us to moralize politics, to enter a kind of denunciatory mode about those who would vote differently or think differently. But it also helps us connect structure and structural analysis about political economy to political imagination, which is colored by fears and affects and fantasies. And so this conversation today is hopefully going to be connecting those things, political economy and political imagination. We have a highly esteemed panel of speakers today. Aditya Chakrabortty is a columnist and senior economics commentator for The Guardian. Over the last few years, he's consistently been one of the most insightful and influential commentators on economics and politics in the UK. We have Clara Mattei, who's the founding president of FREE, the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation, which is now going global, and you can talk some more about that afterwards. She's also an award-winning author of two books, The Capital Order, and most recently, Escape from Capitalism, which you can pick up in the Houseman bookstore at the door. And James Meadway, who is an economist, the host of Macrodose. He's also just recently co-founded Verdant, a green-aligned think tank. And in fact, James and Clara are both also associates of Alameda. I'm going to start with a question to you, Aditya. I'm sure many of us, maybe all of us, still have our minds on the election results of Thursday. And this is a time to think about the monsters. Do you think that the election results indicate a realization of some of the fears, some of the fantasies of progressives in Britain about the monsters that exist in this country? Now, I want you to answer that, obviously thinking about the relationship of this election result and the future of politics here. future of political process, even the future of the political system?
It's impossible to have a political discussion without thinking about the events of the past 2-3 days, right? Clearly, this is an extraordinary moment. You are watching a prime minister being dragged out of number 10, even while he's still clinging to the door frame with his fingernails. And it's worth thinking about how that's, just taking a really, really close-up look at how that's come to happen and what's behind that. There's a woman called Catherine West who most of you wouldn't have known until this weekend. And then she said to Keir Starmer, look, either you go or I'm going to try and force you out. And at that point, all kinds of names are dropped upon her. And she's just a backbench MP. She's reasonably obscure until this weekend. And all sorts of people were calling all sorts of things. One of the messages I got on my phone was agent of Wes, must be an agent of Wes Streeting. And so I thought I'd give her a ring and find out, are you an agent of Wes? So I spoke to her on Sunday evening. I said, what is this? What are you trying to do? And she said something I found very, very wise, actually. She said, look, see it from my point of view. I'm a backbench MP. We have these disastrous results on Thursday. The Prime Minister turns out on Friday morning, says, these are disastrous results. Please stay tuned for my speech on Monday, and then goes away. And then there's no cabinet meeting. And in Wales, where Labour got wiped out, a country they've pretty much owned, they get wiped out and replaced by Plaid Cymru. And in Wales, they put the most kind of old guard of Labour politicians in charge to look into what went wrong. So you can guess how that inquiry is going to go. And then she says, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. Everyone's acting like we've got months and months and months ahead of us to do whatever it is that we think we're going to do. And she said, Westminster is a cocoon. There are so many lovely jobs that you can just settle into them and forget about the world outside. And then in 3 years' time, you wake up and the electoral map has gone light blue. And I was very struck with that word cocoon, protective covering, a shield from the outside world. It kind of carries other associations too. You might talk about complacency or contempt. These are also words in that kind of sphere. Cocoon. And I thought, actually, that's not a bad word to describe the way in which this government in particular has approached the country's problems and how it's going to manage them. So you come to power and you talk about change, and your Prime Minister says, stability is change, which is quite a statement. And then you talk about how the adults are in the room. We're the grown-ups now. We're just going to be really competent. But you've got no content whatsoever. You don't really want to make too much change, despite all you're promising. And meanwhile, all around you, as you saw last week, the country's going further and further away from the political mainstream, from the two parties. So one really interesting fact from last week's elections is 2 out of every 3 voters voted against the governing party or the official opposition. Only 1 in 3 voted Tory or Labour. Right? Very, very quickly, this country's going from being a 2-party system to being a 7-party system, if you include Scotland and Wales. And this is not some new thing. It's been going on for some time. There have been blips and been kind of slight reversals from time to time. The Corbyn period saw actually a lot of kind of a return to 2 tribes. But over the long run, we've come a long way from the 70s, in which you really were either red or blue. Now you can be light blue, green, yellow, whatever. And when we talk about monsters, people will often kind of expect someone like me to say, well, Nigel Farage is a monster. Like that's obviously the time we're in, the time of Nigel Farage. But if you look at what Farage scored in last week's elections, he got 27%. Reform got 27%. 27%, to put that in historical perspective, is what Michael Foot got in 1983 after having written supposedly the longest suicide note in history. And for the younger people in the audience, if you've not heard of Michael Foot, there's a reason. He lost. He got his arse handed to him really badly. And then Maggie Thatcher ran the country for the rest of the decade. So the idea that there's this all-conquering juggernaut of history that's heading direct down tracks and it's inevitable, we can't do anything about them, is balls, absolute balls. What's happening is the political mainstream is cratering away and is too slow, too lumbering to respond. And instead what you see playing, and you can see it going on even today with all the various MP, I'm sure you've got all the various updates on your Guardian app on your phone, right? So you can see which MPs are resigning, which junior ministers are stepping out. And, you know, is that a Wes woman or is that an Andy Burnham supporter? And you have this kind of civil war within the Labour Party between Bolsheviks and Wesheviks, you could say, right? Of no interest, of no real importance. I mean, I can certainly think about who I prefer out of those two. Clue, it's not the Wes guy, but it's of note. But you really are talking about a very small. If you step back, a very small distinction between these two people, and certainly not much in the way of a sense of what they would do differently. So so that term cocoon comes back to me. You know, we used to talk about voting for parties outside the political mainstream, voting for the Greens or Lib Dems or whatever, the SNP. We used to talk about it being a protest vote. Well, it strikes me there's quite a lot to protest about, right? You know, standards of living in this country have barely budged since 2008, since the banking crash. The economy's not really moved forward. You've had various politicians take over, whether they're red or blue or whoever, saying, I've got a plan to do this, that and the other, and whatever their plans were. And you can criticise them, and I have criticised them, but they've never really been able to do anything. They've never really produced a result. Food prices come this autumn will be 50% higher than they were when Russia went into Ukraine. 50%. And you all know that, right? Because you get less in your bag at the end of a shop now. And yet, for some reason, this government in particular, and this is where the Keir Starmer himself kind of becomes the focal point. Keir Starmer began this year talking about a cost of living crisis that he was really going to get a grip on. And then this week, when he wants to reset the 15th, 16th reset of his premiership, he starts talking about how he's going to give you more Europe instead. Right? The sense of being cocooned and always trying to offer you something else according to whatever's polling, whatever he thinks he can buy off. I feel duty bound almost, because this is the point at which someone says, well, Labour have done some good things. And I just want to say, in acknowledgement of that, yeah, they have. They've done, like, I think the Renters' Rights Act was a good thing, but the Renters' Rights Act kind of shows you also what's wrong at the moment, because the Renters' Rights Act basically means you can't get Section 21 out of your rental accommodation, right? But it doesn't stop you getting hiked out of your accommodation. Like, they can still jack up the rents at the next junction and then you can go, right? Tomorrow, in the King's speech, where they lay out their programme of legislation for the Parliament, you will get a social housing bill, and it will be a good one. It will say, no longer can you do right to buy on new council homes. That's important. That means that councils can now viably build new housing at social rent again. But, as you know, there's barely any extra money for building new social homes. And that kind of takes you to the point, right? Baby steps forward, but very little in kind of to reverse the kind of declines in our kind of social contract that we've seen over longer run. Cocooned. This is the actions of a political class that is cocooned from the struggles and the worries and the anxieties and the resentments of lots and lots of people. And in that space, morbid symptoms, to use your term from Gramsci, in that space, morbid symptoms, of course they appear. Why wouldn't they? I went door knocking with the Greens in Lewisham a couple of months ago, and it was extraordinary, right? Lewisham was not a place that the Greens had on the kind of their kind of targets, one of the ones that they thought they were going to take. And they went off door knocking, didn't have very much in the way of a kind of machine. If you've ever gone door knocking with Labour or Tory, or especially with Labour, they've got a real machine for kind of working out which doors they're going to go to, how long they're going to spend, the script they're going to deliver, and then they go. Here they knock on a few doors. But what struck me was the voters, the prospective voters who came to the door, they were the ones suggesting what it was they were really annoyed about, really angry about. And it came down to three things. Gaza, Shabana Mahmood, by name, that she got mentioned. I mean, I didn't hear Keir Starmer's name come up at all, but Shabana Mahmood came up a lot, and the kind of the racist Home Office policies. And then finally, housing and cost of living. They were suggesting these three things over and over again. And again, I walked away and I thought, well, you know what this government's done on Gaza, right? It's been complicit in the massacre of children. It's locked up grannies for saying they support Palestine action. And you know what Shabana Mahmood's, she was talked about a few weeks ago as a viable leadership contender. And you know also that on housing, in London in particular, they've dropped their affordable housing targets to try and compromise with builders. So here is a government that's cocooned, like the previous government's cocooned, and at a certain point, voters are going to turn around and say, well, what else is there? Or the other big thing, they might not come out at all. And that, I think, is actually the most dangerous prospect ahead. But this general sense that we've had since the banking crash of a political class that's not really woken up to the reality of a country that was already kind of living on debt and bullshit for a long time and did not want to rethink what the political business model of this country should be, how we should live. They never wanted to face that. Just wanted to make token gestures, just wanted to talk about levelling up. And each time a big threat comes along, it can't face it off, whether it's Brexit, the complacency, the cocoon quality with which the political class faced into Brexit, and then were slightly horrified when they didn't get the result that they thought they were going to get, right? When it comes to COVID, the way that Boris Johnson keeps away from the various meetings, can't be asked to turn up to a Cobra meeting. And then we all remember what happened at the start of the pandemic. People dying needlessly because of the way this government behaved, the Tory government behaved. And then you come to now, this kind of sense of them being slightly insulated, very insulated from the real struggles of the people they claim to represent. Boris Johnson claimed to represent the working class of the North, don't forget, right? That, I think, is the monster we have to deal with.
Great stuff. You actually mentioned walking in, canvassing in Lewisham. James was a candidate for the Greens running in Tower Hamlet. Unfortunately, wasn't elected this time round, but you were also doing a lot of canvassing, you were knocking on doors. And I'm sure you also heard expressions of fear and resentment and frustration. To what extent were those directly connected to questions of political economy or economic concerns? And to what extent were they connected to other things that you might tie back to economic concerns?
Although it was close, I'll say that. Yes, next time. First of all, I think poor old Gramsci gets as much misused and even misquoted. He's like your one Marxist that is safe to reference in polite company. Michael Gove, to my slight surprise, although perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised, often cites Gramsci as one of his sort of intellectual...
Macron as well.
Yeah, as one of his, well, yeah, that's possibly less surprising, but with one of his intellectual influences. And often the misquoting isn't particularly helpful. I think this whole business in Gramsci of talking about an interregnum and a period where you're just waiting for something else to happen, I think it encourages a terrible complacency, at least on the left, where it's just like, it's okay, this will sort of pass, and then eventually we'll get to the point where the real, like whatever you think the real is, usually it's the real trade union struggle will turn up, the real working class will appear. We can all get back to, it's like the 1970s, and the shop steward movement will come rising by this point out of their graves and marching down Cambridge Heath Road, and we can have a proper strike and it's all going to be really good. And there were kind of glimmers of that coming out of the end of the pandemic, where you saw a wave of strikes directly connected to inflation, which the result of which has been basically to have, by this point, I think, a lower trade union membership than we had coming into that wave of strikes. So the idea that this would represent a reversion to the 1970s, or indeed that a reversion to the 1970s is in fact what is going to happen, is deeply unhelpful. And if you're talking about an interregnum, a period between different sort of stable regimes, or you're talking about, I think worse than that in some ways, just an uninterrupted crisis from the 1970s through to this point, I think you're severely missing the novelty of the situation we're in, and the fact it's completely open-ended, which is the one that is particularly sort of striking, I think, from where I sit and what we all have to grapple with. And what that was saying, if I get back down to the question you asked in terms of what people are talking about on the proverbial doorstep, and how annoying I used to find it for Labour politicians to talk about what people say to them on the doorstep. But nonetheless, it's a really valuable experience to actually have to talk to people and want to hear from them about what their concerns are and what people actually bring forward. And it is the economy. Stupid, but it is the economy in various different forms, in a way that is nothing to do, really strikingly, very, very little to do with the economy as it is usually presented as an object that we're supposed to talk about. And I don't really include, I'm mentioning this to the Aditya here, I don't really include the economics correspondence of our fine national media in this. But if you drag out some of the political correspondence, without naming too many names, although one of them for the BBC was so bad, the BBC had to commission an independent review into its own economic coverage because she kept referring to, the credit card that the national economy is supposed to be like, and it was being maxed out and all this sort of nonsense. And the obsessions that this particular form of coverage of the economy has, which is it's about government debt and about the deficit, and it's about huge, massive things up here. And very, very rarely does it ever get down to the brass tacks of what people are talking about, which is stuff is really expensive and nothing really works. These are fundamental economic questions. It is a fundamental economic question. If you go to the shops and you can't buy as much food as you used to because the price has gone up, this is absolutely central on a daily experience of what you think the economy is. And is there any conversation about that happening in any real sense? Nothing whatsoever. Aditya's right. I mean, we're weeks away at this point from running out of jet fuel in Europe, for example, from an extraordinary surge in the price of food, by all accounts, as a result of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the impact on fertilizer prices, the impact on transport prices. You have to move the food around. And the sense of drift and real sort of fecklessness that you get from this government, but then even worse, from the people who notionally opposing this government. You can go and have a look through some of the extraordinarily lengthy, really, not quite tomes, but various essays and things people have put out, which the Guardian, of course, covered this morning from the Wes camp. What did you call them? Wesheviks? The Wesheviks and the Bernsheviks on the other side have put out their two alternative visions for what Britain should be doing in this profound moment of national crisis, etc., yada, yada. And they barely refer to the crisis. And what you can glean out of these two different sets of propositions is the things that we should be doing is industrial strategy, yes, and maybe borrowing a little bit more, hip hip hooray. Like things we've heard essentially, I would reckon now, for about 15 years. Things that the government of this country has talked about in one form or another since about Theresa May. Absolutely nothing, really, that gets into the seriousness of what you might do, which is how you're going to deal with the fact that everything's going to is already and is going to get even more really expensive for most ordinary people out there. Inadvertently, I think, the person who provided a kind of prescription for what a real programme for government might look like that actually deals with the crisis we're faced was Geeta Gopinath in the Financial Times, writing a couple of days ago. This is the former chief economist of the IMF, now happily ensconced at Harvard, being a professor of economics up there. So she's allowed to say some of the quiet parts out loud. And she presents the usual IMF case. What governments need to do in this moment of profound crisis is means test some benefits and don't bail out too many things and make sure that central banks are still independent. The usual sort of bollocks, to be honest. But then she throws in this warning that, well, if that fails, perhaps there'll be demands for heterodox policy. And she says there will be price controls and we'll have governments asking central banks to set interest rates and we'll have nationalizations. And it's like, wait a minute, you seem to be accidentally laying out precisely what we should be talking about at this moment. Once your, fairly sort of dull list of usual IMF austerity plus let finance do whatever it does and lo, it doesn't work. Once that doesn't work, this is what we should be doing. Is there a single Labour candidate talking in these sorts of terms? No. This is being in the cocoon. This is failing to recognise what people will say in the doorstep, what they will say in opinion polls. What's just fucking obvious if you go to the shops or you have to pay an energy bill anytime soon. So I don't know if that's a monster. I don't know if the fact that people are sort of acting as if none of these things are happening is a monster as such, but it's a deep crisis of our political system that these sorts of issues and demands are almost entirely failed to be recognised by our political representatives, such as they are, who are at this point in time essentially involved in a sort of self-indulgent squabble amongst themselves as to who gets to sit in number 10 whilst the crisis rolls over them in a few weeks' time. And it's kind of pathetic to observe. And what it does tell you is that we need to break out of this. We can't just carry on with a pantomime version of Westminster. And I think Aditya's statistic was very striking in this. Clearly, most people out there, if you're down to a third of the country voting for two parties that used to command, 2/3 of the vote, if not upwards, within the last 10 years or so, then clearly most people out there recognise something like this needs to happen as well.
Thanks, James. Clara, in your new book, Escape from Capitalism, you begin by talking about the 1920s and a moment of worker mobilizations, factory occupations, in fact, Gramsci being one of the leaders in this moment, and the emergence at this time of fascism in Italy. And these were some of the morbid symptoms of that moment. There's a suggestion, perhaps, that there is some similarity between the morbid symptoms experienced in that time and those experienced now in what you write. But at the same time, there's something quite seriously and substantively new about the moment, not just in relation to 100 years ago, but in relation to 10, 15 years ago. Now, you live much of the time in the United States and you're spending time in Italy, you are Italian. In those two contexts in particular, what do you see as substantively new in the politics of today?
One has to keep in mind that we are at levels of unprecedented inequality, levels of inequality that in the UK is represented by the fact that there's 58 billionaires now around. There were 55 last year. And there are 31% of the children in the UK are in poverty. So in a class of 30, that's over 9 kids who are in poverty. And so what we see today is really, I would say, the most obvious manifestation of the violence of this economic system. And of course, right outside of the UK, we see that we have an area in which we have the highest density of amputated children, the highest density of orphan children, and the highest density of acutely malnourished children. In Gaza now there's over 100,000, while militarism is going up. And we call this defense industry. Really what this is imperialist destruction of the global south and soon also of the global north. Right, so this is the ecological devastation that is going to burn also those billionaires who think they have it all. So I would like to point out how what was happening in the 1920s was what I think was one of the real existential crisis of the capital order. My first book is called The Capital Order because I want to stress exactly what James was pointing out, that there is no such thing as the economy, right? This is what we need to do right now to confront the acute crisis, is to use concepts that are not the concepts that keep us complacent even without realizing, right? So the left, unfortunately, is guilty because it's incapable of economic and political imagination using concepts that keep us tied to this world that we are living in, which is the most horrendous and violent. And I mean, if we're not all depressed, God knows how it's possible still. So this is the point, is that, economists tell you, oh, the economy is not working. No, I'm sorry. The economy is working as it should. And this needs to be underlined because unfortunately, a lot of progressive economists keep tricking us and making us think that the problem here is excessive monopoly power, excessive corruption, excessive financialization, some form of crony capitalism. There's something that has gone wrong within capitalism that is the reason why there's so much inequality and suffering and violence. This is unfortunately, I think, a narrative that is very myopic and serves the purpose of keeping us blind to the reality. And the reality is that now, as people understood very well and during the Red Biennium, 1918-1919, that I've studied in depth, and yes, Gramsci was very anti-establishment then he got normalized, but at the time he was leading the factory councils and demanding an actual economic democracy, right? So it was very different from the type of wishy-washy Gramsci that you study now in school. So this is the whole point, is that what we see today is the manifestation of what capitalism actually looks like in a very overt fashion. And I think this stresses the fact that there's no such thing as the economy. There is such thing as the capital order that stresses the fact that markets are not the realm of freedom and opportunity and spontaneous improvement of efficiency in people's lives. Markets are based on fundamental relations of exploitation. And these relations of exploitation are not spontaneous. They have to be constantly enforced. And this is why I think it's important to talk about order, because it's politically constructed. And this is the very important point, because the left somehow thinks that there's still a division between the market and the state, that the market functions on its own, and that the state in a way can intervene or interfere or, do something. The reality is that under capitalism, the state was the reason why the markets were emerged, because of violent intervention through austerity policies, what we still see today in privatization of the commons, that produced that market dependence that traps us all. The fact that the majority of us, to survive, obviously has to go work for a wage, to work for someone else, to produce bombs that go kill other people. And this is what we have left in order to survive, right? So it's very important for me that we move away from these categories that somehow I think really are anachronistic, or in a way they were always part of a bourgeois ideology that never really represented what capitalism was in the first place. And like in the 1920s, in which, I did research on how the state intervening dramatically in enforcing exploitation very overtly during the First World War, right? Because people were at the front. There was a problem because workers were getting highly empowered because there were very few workers around. And this meant that the government had to very clearly intervene politically to say, no, workers, we are now going to discipline you. We are now going to set wages for you. We are now going to avoid you moving around and making your bargaining power work. So in that historical moment, the fact that there was no distinction between the market and the state, this is what the shop stewards in the 1920s understood, that it was actually like the state there would be no market without the state violently enforcing market dependence and exploitation. This is something that I think people are ready to see also now. And this is clearly also related to, of course, the imperialist maneuvers of the global hegemonic power. So this is, I think, really important right now is, so to realize that we need to just start thinking differently. If we want to be on the left, we need to talk about post-capitalism. And I think this is really important because there is no such thing as humane capitalism. I hope we understand this. And this is very important. And this is another very big trope on the left, is the fact that, you say how bad things are. They're like, but there was a moment, we did have the golden age. Why don't we try to go back to a form of welfare state that supposedly thrived in the 50s and 60s throughout, at least in a way, the West, the North. Right. Again, very Western-centric view, by the way, because the majority of the globe is still subordinated. And what you find out, and this is the research I'm conducting now, I was just at the archives this morning, is that is a pure illusion. The term austerity was actually coined after the Second World War, and used by who? By the Labour Party. And again, the supposed Labour Party in the UK that in the 64 had opened up to more radical policies, had to shut everything very quickly down in just a year and produce exactly what we're seeing now. Interest rates that go up, that are not solving inflation, but they are increasing the rate of exploitation. And again, this is what interest rates are meant to do. They're not meant to solve inflation, especially when inflation is due to, imperialist destruction abroad. They are meant to stabilize labor relations against workers. And this has worked very, very well. Again, interest rate hikes have been working. And I really hope this is clear. The economy has been working. In its classist, violent face, it's always been about. So this is really important, is that interest rates going up is producing the effect of increasing labor precariousness, weakening workers. The dosage of industrial austerity that goes with it produces, I'll also tell an anecdote, given that we had a couple. I took a cab yesterday from Ryanair Airport to Ryanair Airport. Sorry, yeah, Stansted, which is Ryanair Airport. The owners are, yeah, exactly, to Stansted Airport. And, the cab driver I asked him, how it was going. He told me, well, I'm a contractor for the only cab company that is there that has a contract with the airport. They take 50% of the drive. I have to pay for gas. And, gas has gone up in the past few months by almost 20%. And I have to pay for the car if it breaks. And I also rent the car from them. So he rents the car from them, is a contractor, so gets no benefits, no vacation. And he told me, I asked him, how much did you make? And he told me, I made £600 in the last 2 weeks, but almost half has gone for gas. And he was really optimistic, and I was just like, well, how do you, how do you make it? But this is, and he tells me, well, my colleagues, I only work 10 hours a day because I can't work more than that. But my colleagues work more, and those colleagues, they're Asian, they come from other countries, so there's already this thing. And I told him, why don't you tell the company that if the gas goes up, you literally won't be able to drive because you won't bring any money home? And he says, well, but they're Asians and they want to work harder. We don't share the same values. What we can understand as being the way in which the working class is divided always more. So, yeah. So, I don't know if I answered your question. I would say that what we see today is an explosion of things people already in 1919 understood. And in 1919, there was an existential crisis in the sense that people were contesting the essence of capitalism, which is wage labor and our relations of exploitation. And what I hope is that this will happen today as well, given that the ecological crisis is, of course, accelerating these social inequalities.
Clara, I want to direct another question back to you on the same points that you've been making, because it seems to me that there is a difference in the way that an austerity regime functions in a moment in which the state has a central role in reproducing labor, and a different moment in which the state might well have given up on that, at least in the way that it used to in that so-called golden era. That is, that there is an increasing portion of the population that seems to be superfluous to a regime of accumulation. Because they're lost in the gig economy and they can't even make their way with 3-4 gigs at the same time. And at that moment, the kind of compulsions that capital exercises over workers they're quite different. So how would you differentiate between the austerity regime as it emerged in your description after the Second World War, both conceptually and in practice, to what we have today, which is a continuous crisis of reproduction?
What we have today is the success of austerity in its purest form, right? Austerity has produced exactly what it was supposed to produce, which is this highly precarious, highly redundant, and superfluous majority that helps maintain that basically what's it called, the chokehold for everybody else, right? So I think this is another trope we have to demystify, is the idea that austerity. There's two camps. There's the technocrats that will tell you that austerity is necessary because we have lived beyond our means and we need to pay back our debt, and that it's a technical necessity. And then there's those on the supposed left that tell you, well, austerity never worked, it never really solved debt, it never really helped the economy grow. It's actually irrational corruption, stupidity. Literally, this is how it's being analyzed. Like, it's zero compelling it's like, okay, yes, if it's stupidity, why then is it like so integral to the DNA of our economy? Maybe you should ask yourself that question. But this is actually the level of the conversation, actually. Why? Well, because this is depoliticizing the conversation. It goes back to the idea that we're just like manipulating an economy that is a whole, and that you can either, you either accelerate the growth, right? You actually like either heat it up or cool it down. This is how economists think in macroeconomic terms. This is very Keynesian, right? The idea that it's actually like stimulating or recessionary. It's either on or off. And again, you see, it gives you the false illusion that it's either the state in or the state out. And it's either up or it's down. And it's like as the whole is moving. And you see, this is really like the way our brain then stops working, because this has nothing to do with the whole. It has all to do with like, who is in the whole? What about the parts? What about the class analysis that like economists like still, unfortunately, try to avoid as much as possible? And if you focus on that and you politicize the issue, you realize this economy is not a given. If there are no exploitable people, there is no capitalism. And the institutions like the central banks themselves understand very, very well. So I would say that definitely now the dismantlement of the welfare state has gone a longer way. But the welfare state was the product of labor struggles. And I think this is another very important point that we have to remember. It's not just by electing the nice guy in office that you're going to get welfare reforms, okay? This is unfortunately another the welfare reforms that have been enacted by the capitalist states, beginning from the very first phase of welfare measures in the UK were actually implemented after the First World War, right? In 1920 with the Ministry of Reconstruction. Why? Well, because the UK had never seen such high levels of strikes in its history. Okay, so the moment in which the welfare measures were enacted was in a response to very, very organized working people, right? So, and then the tendency for the system is to dismantle. And what's important to note for me is that fiscal austerity is not just budget cuts. It's cuts in social expenditures, while the state is actively shifting resources to subsidize and de-risk private investors. Of course, now fewer and fewer, concentration of power that is, of course, in the hands of the big three that basically control the majority of the wealth on the globe. So this is, I think, the point is here that there is no... I would see it just as a continuity, is like, now we've gotten to a point that is very functional for this type of economy, because now most people have to buy their own social insurance, like even medical insurance. I think also in the UK, people will start buying their own insurance. They probably already do. And this is great for the big three because, they've financialized and are speculating heavily also on the economy of supposed care, which is, of course, not care because it's led by the profit motive.
Thanks, Clara. James, much of the commentary in Britain about the collapse of the social pacts under neoliberalism has focused on politics and the failure of political strategy. And a lot of the work that you've been doing has been trying to connect economic transformations at bigger scales than those that are often written about by economic commentators in the UK to what's going on here. So in an essay you've been writing for this project, the After Order project, you talk about climate sovereignty after a crisis of the Anthropocene. And you've been also connecting what might be the end of the neoliberal period to the emergence of new forms of renewable energy and the rise of China. What would you identify as the big transformations in political economy as they connect to some of the things you were discussing earlier?
Look, I think Clara's just identified something very useful, which is this sort of tendency, particularly in sort of Northern Europe or Western Europe, to divide the history of the last sort of 70 years or however long since the Second World War into a period of, one way or another, a kind of golden age of some form, which is a post-war settlement, and we all have welfare states that function. And then suddenly everything goes wrong and it's all just bad and downhill forever and ever. And this is like the period of the last 40 years that we're going to call neoliberalism. And I don't think this really significantly misses the entirety. First of all, globally, this does not describe the experience of the last sort of 70 years or so. If you want to talk about a golden age in capitalism, any period of time, I would suggest pretty clearly it's a period from the late 1990s into the 2000s, and extended beyond that if you're in China, for example. If you take an actual global view of what a golden age might look like, which is improvements in living standards and lots of jobs being created and this sort of thing, that's when the golden age happens. The golden age, such as it was for capitalism in Hobsbawm, Eric Hobsbawm calls it this in his big book, The Age of Extremes, is like confined to a very small part of the world at the time. first of all. And that even then, it's pretty conditional. I think it's right to make that point. So we have to have a kind of a periodization of what's just occurred that isn't something like it was all good and then it's bad for 40 years, right? This is obviously not true, and not even true, I'd suggest, for a lot of working class experience in this country. You know, my most boring centrist dad opinion is that the 2000s were actually quite nice for a bunch of people. You know, and it's kind of obvious if you look at the figures, obvious if you remember what it was actually like, that you did have an expanding welfare state. You did have not inflation now running at 4 or 5%. You did have an expansion of consumer products available to buy. There were all sorts of problems loaded into that, but they weren't the kind of problems that you're running into now. And this is peak neoliberalism in this country and globally during that period of time. So the reconceptualization we need is to stop thinking that neoliberalism is the worst thing that could ever exist, because fairly clearly what we're getting now is going to be a lot worse, right? First, so let's have a little bit of a failure of imagination, not just on what the alternatives are, but also a failure of imagination to think about what might happen that would be even worse than neoliberalism, because there is a whacking great stack of various different versions of authoritarian capitalism, which is where we're headed, where you have a genuine form of austerity, where it is extremely hard to obtain the essentials of life, housing, energy, food, even water, and at the same time you've got massive repression loaded on top of that. That is substantially worse than the neoliberal period. The other bit, I think, and this is the really big periodization that I think we have to start getting used to, is to stop thinking about climate change as something that will happen in the future and start thinking about climate change and the crisis of nature as something that is in fact happening now and is messing up people's lives right now in one form or another. And that goes from the really obvious extreme weather versions of this, terrible floods, massive droughts, this sort of thing, or the more common lived experience, the reason there are people talking to me about why things cost so much, the reason we all experience this, which is inflation being driven up over time by the fact that it's harder to grow food in various parts of the world and transport it, and that extreme weather and drought and the rest of it does in fact make it harder to grow food. Now, the really capitalist part of that is the fact that you have an essential in short supply means that it is a golden opportunity for the companies that dominate the supplies of those essentials to make profits like never before. In recent weeks, you've seen this with oil companies. We'll see this fairly soon with the major global agribusinesses, as we've seen over the last 5-6 years or so. The critical political point here is that we have to think about a version of capitalism that is locked into the crisis that it is essentially created. On a world historic scale, that's what climate change means. This is the product of 250 odd years of industrialized capitalism and burning the fossil fuels and exploiting every other natural resource you can. And that is the backwash that we now live with. But the fact you have this backwash means that first, this doesn't just end civilization or whatever. I mean, there are some outside chances that this does in fact occur, but the most likely experience is that we just carry on with things being bad and capitalism is still there. And the periodization, the temporality that we have to think about is exactly that point of not something where this halts and ends and we're in a new state of the world and that's it, but in fact a kind of crisis that just continues with capitalism still there, with at least certain parts of capital doing very, very nicely out of it. And in particular, I'd highlight the role of very, very large companies in the supply of essentials. That the essentials are things you cannot avoid spending even if the price goes up. Most stuff, if it's more expensive to go to the cinema, you don't go to the cinema. If it's more expensive to eat, you have to carry on eating. So you can make money hand over fist. This is what the form of capitalism we appear to be getting looks like. There are more positive versions of that where you can see the emergence of, and lots of people get very excited about this, around electrostates. The fact that we are genuinely seeing a transition in the way that energy is produced across the globe. But it is arriving at the same time as we are genuinely starting to see the effects of climate change because we weren't able to do that renewable energy transition rather sooner. Put all this together, and this is the sort of permanent state of crisis that we now live in. And I think that once we stop trying to think about wouldn't it be good to implicitly or otherwise turn the clock back to some point of the golden age, something that used to be good in the past, or for that matter, expecting the kind of agency and the agents that we saw in the past to reappear. Just on that, I think Clara mentioned the First World War. There's a story about the First World War, if you're on the left, which goes, it was a terrible war, and at the end of it, there were lots of strikes and near revolutions across Europe. And that captures an important part of what happened, very obviously. This is, in fact, what happened. But if you go and look at what was occurring in this country, why did we get the first rent controls introduced in this country? Who was it that delivered those rent controls? It wasn't workers going on strike in factories. It was a rent strike in Glasgow, led primarily by women at the time, who so frightened the government that they introduced national rent controls, and that was the first rent controls introduced here, later scrapped in 1988 or thereabouts under the Conservative government. That was a struggle not at the point of production, not by workers in the usual lefty sense you'd think about it. This was a struggle on the site of social reproduction. And it strikes me in a period of crisis like we're in and will not get out of, those are the sort of struggles that are the most useful to refer back to and what we ought to be thinking about when we think about how we organise in the future.
Thanks, James. Aditya, you tend not to refer to neoliberalism. I think, Clara, as well, you don't talk much about neoliberalism. It might be for different reasons, but I think you'd also contest that there was anything like a liberal or neoliberal order. And I wanted to know why that might be. Is that an implication that there might have been more continuity than change, or there is now? And I suppose discuss that in relation to some of the economic transformations that we've been seeing.
I don't use the word neoliberal and I don't use the word order for different reasons. But I'd talk about the order bit first, actually. The sense that there is an order, I think, is always kind of propounded by people who want to view an order. And that's either people obviously propounding the sense that there is an order, but also critics, because they want to have a sense of ideas which they can give perhaps more coherence and clarity than they actually merit. And part of the reason I don't use that term order is partly it's biographical. I grew up actually in London at the end of the train line that leads into here. So Cambridge Heath is the nearest train station. If you take that train out of here for half an hour, you get to Edmonton Green, which is where I grew up. Zone 4 London. I dare say most of you haven't visited, but when I was growing up in the 80s there, it had reams of light industry still there. So the big names of Thorn EMI, which produced Ferguson television, it was a huge conglomerate. MK Electric did sockets and plugs and all that kind of stuff, and Belling ovens. And so it basically did all the stuff that the post-war British home needed to feel like they were getting consumer goods. And when I was growing up there, it was all popping off. They were all disappearing bit by bit by bit. And I was one of the very few non-white faces around in this very white area. My mum taught in Clapton in Hackney, which I dare say more of you do know. She was there in the pre-sourdough years, when actually she taught in a school just off a road that used to be called Murder Mile. Lovely. But all those kind of those faces that were around me at the time in the 80s and the early 90s, they were basically angry white men who were watching their livelihoods disappearing. And my parents moved out of that area just across the road in the early 90s. And, then university comes in, you go off to work and you kind of forget a bit about where you're from. And I went back in the early 2010s. And I went back really to do some reporting on austerity. And I wanted to see what kind of impacts it had on an area that I knew. And so I went off looking for austerity and impacts of austerity. And there were all sorts of people happy to show a local boy around and, what the area was like now. But what I saw wasn't the impact of austerity at all. I mean, there was nothing there that could have been fixed by an extra youth club or a few longer hours at the library. None of that. To give you a sense, all those factories had gone. There was a girl who I met, one of their the brightest. The council brought out some of their best and brightest students to meet me, and this girl lived like a minute away from my old house. And I said, "Oh, so you're back onto that park? You must be in there all the time." And I'm remembering, your first ride without stabilizers, new tricycle, and all of that. And she says, "No, I never go there." And I found out later why, because another girl, an 11-year-old girl, had got off the bus, been followed by a man into that park and sexually assaulted for 3 hours after school, and then he let her go home in her school uniform. And then I spoke to some kids and I was like, "Oh, so you live near me as well, right? So what's it like there?" And they're like, literally, I'm looking at, these are Bangladeshi kids, I'm Bengali from West Bengal. And so I'm looking at kids who could be me. And they're like, "Yeah, it's all right, except the lights from the police helicopters come on at night through the front window, so we don't really get that much sleep." And then my own paper published a picture of the road that leads off mine, so 5 minutes walk. And I'm looking at just the kind of house I grew up in. Like, so it's like a small 2 up, 2 down, what estate agents now call worker cottages. And it's got pebble dash and a really narrow yard and a porch which can only fit one person. And there's like 12 kids, a dozen children lined up outside, and like a bunch of £5 flowers in plastic because one of their mates had been stabbed to death and they were there to commemorate his death. And later on, I went past the school at lunchtime and they were doing the same ritual for another kid who'd been stabbed to death. And this was all happening on the streets where I grew up, right? And this is happening in 2010, 2011, 2012, when most of the left that you were talking about, we were talking about austerity and about bad Osborne and bad Cameron. And if only, you know, a lot of people in the kind of the centre left were talking about industrial strategy. They were even then, James. And then you realise, right? What are the outskirts of a city to the city? They're where you put all the bad shit. They always have been. They're where you put the lunatic asylums and the people who who you need to bang up, because that's where you put the prisons as well. Prisons and lunatic asylums and hospitals, they always have tended to go, and the cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries, they always tend to go to the city limits. And Edmonton has got all of those, the workhouses and the rest. And so in plain sight, in this era in which everyone's talking about London, you know, the 2010s, you remember that time when people talk about London as being this golden place, right? Cranes everywhere, the Olympics, extravagant restaurants. Well, half an hour from here, half an hour from the City of London, from all the banks, you're looking at people basically, you can look out onto Canary Wharf, you can see that skyline that looks like a line graph, and they will never be part of that. And then I remember at that time talking to people about it, why it was like this, and they would talk about it as though it was a kind of private shame, as though it was their area that fucked up, right? You had the bad luck to live there, you fucked up. Right. And I remember at that time, I mean, I've spent about, 15 years kind of reporting around Britain. You'd go to these areas which had lost their economy, basically, lost the sense in which they had jobs in which they might provide for them. And they were going into the kind of the gig jobs that you were talking about, or their kids were getting put in prison. You know, that's what you do with surplus populations, right? You put them in prison. And then, in each of these areas, they'd talk about as though it was their own area's loss. They'd lost out. They'd been unlucky. It was their bad kismet to have been born in this area. And I think the big change that's happened, Juliano, is that much more recently, with the advent of first COVID and then Ukraine and now this latest crisis, you've got 3 national crises in the space of just over half a decade. And I think that has given a sense there is a much more widespread crisis. But actually, these crises have been playing out at the best of times for this country, in the times that Blair and Brown and Cameron, they were all celebrating. They were already happening, and they weren't happening far from here, right? So I don't talk about order, because to me, it's always been a case of disorder, but disorder kept away from the public discourse. Even now it's going on in the way that people talk about politics. You know, what did Starmer, I was just reading an interview with Starmer from last summer, and the interviewer says, do you agree that Britain is broken? Do you think it needs serious change? And he says, no, it needs competence. So I think there's been a persistent attempt to kind of shield your eyes from the reality. And lots of people live in that reality. And because it's not represented, talked about, give you another example, HMOs and fly tipping, houses of multiple occupation and fly tipping. Now, you don't go to the suburbs to rent and live a city life, right? And back in the 2000s, people did not rent in Zone 4 London. So in my area, I think something like less than 10% of the housing was up for private rental. Along my road now, we've now got a system of landlord licensing. Along my old road, remember, 2 up, 2 downs, not the sort of place that you would, you know, quite far from central London. Over 40% of that road is now in the landlord economy. And these tiny houses are being extended backwards, sideways, upwards, right? So they're being turned into houses of multi-occupation. And one of the consequences of this kind of new economy that suddenly descended upon this outskirt of London is that you will go past a house which has got beautiful window boxes, freshly painted doors, all the rest of it, and it's right next door to a place with yellow net curtains. The wheelie bin's got its lid open, and it's vomiting its rubbish all over the street. You'll see that right next to each other. Very, very common sight now. So I then looked around. I thought, this is really weird. Where is the political recognition that there is even a problem? Fly tipping is something that my council talks about an awful lot. And HMOs, massive problem. Who's talking about it? Nigel Farage, Robert Jenrick. I look across for Labour recognition of this, for Tory recognition of this. Nowhere. So this general sense in which there is this breakdown of order right next to you is being handed over to the far right. Another example is the asylum hotels. What are asylum hotels? They're places that have been turned into houses of multiple occupation, normally in poor parts of the country, right? And normally what happens is, it's a classic case of the state and the private sector coordinating with each other to create a crisis, because the state declares you can't get asylum in this country. We're going to shut down pretty much all legal routes. So you're forced to come over in a boat. As soon as you turn up on sand, you have to claim for asylum. And then you'll get placed in accommodation typically with one of 3 large companies. And they'll put you in one of these houses of multiple occupation. And if you live there, and I've been to places where these HMOs have suddenly gone up, you're normally in a town or a suburb that has reached the end of its days, has gone downhill pretty quickly, and then this thing turns up. And you don't know where it's come from, and you don't know what it's got to do with you, and all you know is these people are moving in. And that gets racialized, of course it does, because the racists are the only people talking about it, right? Your local Labour council, or your local regional government, normally Labour, they've accepted the contract. They've accepted this is happening, right? So who goes in? Tommy Robinson's boys, Nigel Farage's boys, any grifter off YouTube. The Katie what's her face, that woman who talked about cockroaches. I can't remember her name now. But all of these sorts of really unsavory characters turn up and they do their speeches, and that is what happens, because you have this huge amount of disorder that's going on all the time. The forces of order aren't willing to talk about it. They're not willing to come up with economic or policy responses to it. So it becomes culturalized. And then we call, why are these bad racists talking about this culture war issue? It's not a culture war issue. It's a basic issue which an average person who feels enough of a loss of agency anyway in their working place, along their local high street, which is emptied out, and now on their very road, they're suddenly seeing HMOs come up. Well, of course they're going to react violently to that.
I just want to do a round of questions on the political implications of what we've been discussing. So James, with your hat on as co-director of Verdant, but also as a Green candidate, you've talked about the relevance of policy and specific policy in this moment in relation to comms strategy, for example. What would be the policies that you think are most important for the left, and in particular radicals, those who want to pursue an agenda of social transformation right now?
I mean, I think we have to get to the heart of why people are specifically angry about the crisis that they're facing, which is a crisis in the price of stuff that you need to exist, right? So it's the price of housing, it's the price of food, and it's the price of energy primarily. And so that means you have to be talking about price controls in some form. And the mucking around and failing to do this is one of the things that's going to cost us dearly. At some point, Nigel Farage, who doesn't care really about what he's going to say or how he's going to get there, will come out in some form of price controls, I would have thought, when we hit like the real sort of price surge over this summer. And we need to be there first. I mean, just anecdotally, I thought one of the breakthroughs, one of the few sort of success stories that the left had in the last few years was the Don't Pay campaign for energy price rises, where you had, about 1 million odd people at least on paper saying that they weren't going to pay their energy bill due to the price rise, which forced the government to introduce a fairly mad, hugely expensive price control known as the energy price guarantee. Originally costed £120 billion. It played no small part in getting rid of Liz Truss as Prime Minister when all of this was revealed and bond markets panicked. But the flip side of that was exactly those grifters of the far right that you mentioned, Aditya, were fuming that a bunch of basically anarchists and their hangers-on from down the road from here had got ahead of this issue and built up a massive database of people who said they wanted to take action on this and were going to do something pretty dramatic and radical on it. They were fuming about this because they want to get there first. They want to claim these issues, and they are moving fast to try and claim it. So if we want to do something, and this isn't about, and I get really fed up sometimes, comms is important, of course, we all know this. It's important to be able to talk to people. It's important to be able to do this. But the reason Zoran Mamdani fundamentally is good at what he's doing is not just he's a good communicator, he's also got something to say. And we've had a little bit too much on all parts of the left of going, hey, we've got really good policies, we just have to present them properly so these poor benighted folks out there understand. No, sometimes we don't have really good policies. Sometimes our standard list of things we do, which is industrial strategy, maybe we'll borrow a bit more money, isn't really enough to get into the situation that we're in. We have to be talking about price controls. We have to be talking about how you regulate markets. We have to be talking about how you take on capital and profiteering in the middle of a crisis. And you have to do it in those sorts of terms.
Thanks, James. Aditya, one of the policy agendas that the left is pushing hard at the moment is on taxation and wealth tax. And you came out with an article in The Guardian a little while ago saying that maybe that wasn't enough, or that the left should be more ambitious. And I wanted to ask you what you see as being more ambitious than that right now. It seems that a wealth tax is a measure that could actually have some effect in the UK. But you would perhaps argue against that and suggest that there needs to be something else or something more.
So I wasn't arguing against it. I wouldn't argue against it. My response is really yes and. Right? Because if you think about the issues we've been talking about say the loss of industry, and what matters to me more from that is a loss of kind of viable lives for people. Like a wealth tax on very rich people will raise you some money, but it won't do very much to touch the sides of those people. So as a first step, it's fine, right? And there are various kind of self-declared technocrats who will say it's impossible to do. Well, actually, it's not impossible to do a wealth tax. The Doomsday Book was actually a record of wealth that should be used to tax. I mean, the Doomsday Book is a register for wealth tax, so it goes back that far. Perfectly possible to do if you really want to do it. However, it's not enough. I mean, you hear some of that in what I think in what James just said about the need to control the basics of life. But just to give you a slightly different answer, just to keep things lively, the thing that really gets my go is a sense of talking about growth and talking about AI and talking about the need to compete on a world stage. Like, I remember when the government used to talk about finance as being the Midas industry, and now it's technology. But the percentage of our economy that's in tech is about 5%. And, there are so many other industries that you could talk about as being important. In London, which is supposedly the city of bankers, there are far more care workers than there are bankers. And yet, how often do we talk about care workers? And in fact, the government actually goes after care workers with its visa regime, right? So, I mean, my personal sense is that we ought to talk less about these kind of leading edge competitive industries and much more about the foundational stuff, because that's where most of us actually live, right? We worry about how we're going to pay for our housing. We worry about our health, and we want decent healthcare. We worry about our kids' schools, and we worry about the basic interaction of services on the street level. And that's really where I think the any kind of viable left agenda should focus itself. I have to say, I don't ever really personally, I don't get out of bed and think, what's a really left-wing idea I should have today, or what's a really radical thing I'm going to do. I don't think about that at all. But I do think about what would a kid in Edmonton or any of these other places, what would they actually need? Well, they'd want to go to school safely. They'd want to get a sense that they weren't going to, go past a number of trap houses on their way home. They'd want to have the sense that there might be some kind of life for them, which, was better than the Amazon warehouse, which is now one of the big employers in my old area. This general sense of just a viable life where things are taken out of the market and you don't have to worry about huge rent rises all of a sudden, and you can actually have social housing, which might be decent. I'd be much more up for that kind of agenda. And you can call that left-wing or radical or whatever. In this current context, I suppose that does sound radical, but it shouldn't be, right? But the thing I think we ought to be looking towards is trying to build a coalition with a bunch of people who don't think of themselves as left-wing or radical, but do worry an awful lot about their kids. The thing that strikes me as being the prevailing and most important political mood of the past 15, 20 years, and it's grown and grown and grown. I've seen it grow as a reporter in front of me, is a sense that tomorrow will be worse than today, and today won't be as good as yesterday. And I see that in more and more areas, and it has percolated across from, the deindustrialized working class to now the precarious middle class, right? But that now is the most important political mood. And the prize will go to whichever project can channel that into an actual meaningful set of policies.
Yeah, I think the yes and more is so important, particularly when there is obviously an agenda of decreasing expectations. And in fact, consistently through my adult life, one of the things that has frustrated me is the way in which redistribution and reducing inequality has been pitched as some kind of lofty ideal. In fact, it's a liberal con, not because more equality is a bad thing, no, but in fact, equality was always the radical liberal ideal. Yeah. In fact, it's not a noble ideal. The socialist and Marxist ideal is freedom.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's freedom from the condition of exploitation and the alienation that produces. Clara, I guess that by naming your forum Free, you probably feel that way as well. But then how does equality relate to freedom now, maybe as an entry point? And what are the signs of hope that you see right now in connecting those two and trying to go yes, but more?
Yeah, I see a lot of sign. I think this is a really, really fertile moment to actually engage in transformative politics that involve the community. I mean, even in the US, you see it, there's so many people that are on the streets, solidarity with the migrants against ICE, this whole thing about No King's Day that I hate as a name because it gives you the sense, of course, that the problem is only Trump. But anyway, the point is that people are in the street. The point is, how do we organize, channel, give some form of robust framing to this energy? And this is where I think, again, those who call themselves left, and I agree, I don't particularly like the label at all, any myself, have completely failed because they like to just, sit around and talk about big concepts and hear who has read the most cutting edge book, but then they don't do any work on the ground. They don't give a shit because they're lucky enough to be in their own bubble. I'm an academic. I know how the bubble works and I've been in that bubble, and it's really sad because then sure, you can come up with like super cool radical ideas, but then the disconnect, at that point, the left is more problematic than the supposed right, because at least, the supposed, austere economists are at least more coherent between their ideas and their actions, right? And this was the whole point about Gramsci, was exactly about, well, we need coherence on the post-capitalist alternatives as well. And so we need to participate. And it's really difficult because if you do it in academia, they think you're less, right? They think you're not an academic anymore. My colleague told me, then now you're an influencer. I'm like, I'm sorry, no, I'm not an influencer. I just would like to make what we study actually relevant to potentially do something, right? Truth is actually what works in transforming this world, according to a certain tradition. So this is something that I think is really important, is that there's a lot on the ground, but it needs to be organized. And there's a lot of real experiments and alternatives out there. We never talk about them, and we rarely connect them with one another. And so I think right now that is what the Free is trying to do. It's one experiment out of many, but the idea is that we are channeling, we're using public events. By the way, we're having one tomorrow in Bishop Stortford with Camila Vergara, who's here, and Carolina Alves, who's a colleague of ours, also wonderful critical economist, to use a public event to attract those who not necessarily have the luck of sitting around, and you do it with flyers and talking to people and getting out of the bubble of social media. You actually go and speak to people, not just for electoral purposes, but as just in terms of on the ground, and then you start seeing if people want to aggregate through assemblies. And the Free is an assembly right now. We have over 80 people who have come together. Many of our members are in very difficult, precarious housing situations, unemployed, live off of food stamps. One of our community board members actually her only ways of survival is trading food stamps that Trump is cutting, by the way. Okay, so, people who know what capitalism looks like because they live it. And the assembly now has struck one success, which is really incredible. We did an event on participatory budgeting as an alternative to austerity. And just 2 days ago, I found out that the mayor of Tulsa that we had like kind of invited and pressured on the point now has started his participatory budgeting experiment without, of course, like giving us any recognition. But the point was that we did introduce something radical in town, and, you know, Tulsa is a very red state. And now there is reaction, because when you pressure institutions, that's the only way to get something done, I think, right? So that's the thing, is connecting knowledge, critical knowledge. We also do have a YouTube channel with some activity on the ground. If I can say just one more word, because I really want to stress that what I said badly before was just to indicate that what is rational for the logic of profit is irrational for the logic of need. And this people understand. So the problem with a lot of economists is that they keep telling us, again, the problem is that the economy is not working. The problem is that, the problem here is that we need to stop thinking in universal terms and realize that things work for the logic of profit, which is the logic that dominates our social relations. And it's been working because that capital accumulation is happening in very accelerated terms. Wealth is being produced and accumulated as it should, but of course it is not working for us, for our purpose. And I would just like to stress that the UK government, is spending now 62 billion in defense, and it's spending 2.8 billion on temporary accommodations for people with housing problems, okay? 62 billion is also more than what it spends on secondary education. I think these topics is what people understand and are pissed off about, but this being pissed off can be channeled in, well, how do we create then a logic of need that overcomes and dominates over the logic of profit? And I do think that electing people is not enough if there's not an organized structure at the bottom that then can dialectically pressure the so-called elected officials. And this, I think, is really, really important. And I hope we can do more of this.
Thanks, Clara. And with that, I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring this to a close. We're out of time. You can follow Macrodose and continue to listen to James and others who engage on that podcast. This is the end of the first series of After Order, but there is another one in the works, so look out for that. I'd like to thank all my colleagues here for a fantastic conversation, for your participation. I'd like to thank all of you for your presence. I'd like to thank those who contributed to putting this on, my colleagues at Alameda, Zara, Alex, Ben, and at Planet B Productions, Freddie, Max, Rob, Tony, Ben as well. I think I've got everyone, yeah. All the staff here at Acrylicize. You can stay for drinks, and if you have questions, come and approach the panel. Thanks again.